Hi, I'm Ms. Collier, and on this episode of the Tortilla Cat Files, I want to talk about the Pilgrims and Plymouth Colony. Now, a lot of us know a lot of this story already, but I want to get down into the real nitty-gritty specifics of it. The Pilgrims were a group of 100 people who set sail from Plymouth, England in September of 1620 on board a ship called the Mayflower. Now, this group included 35 people who were members of what was called the English Separatist Church. Now, a separatist is somebody who wants to be apart. I don't like what's going on here. I'm going to be apart from this. I'm going to start my own group. I'm going over here. I don't want to be part of your group. That's a separatist. This was what this church had done. Now, there had been a lot of upheaval in the British church. Henry VIII, several years before, had broken with the Catholic Church and declared that England was now a Protestant nation and had established the Episcopalian religion as the religion of England. A lot of people were happy with that. A lot of people were not. We're now several rulers past Henry VIII. Elizabeth I has recently died. Well, a few years before has died. And actually her nephew, James I, who was James VI of Scotland, has come to be the King of England. This causes a lot of problems because the English and the Scots don't always get along, even still today. And a lot of people are still upset about that. He is a little more lenient about some things. The Separatist Church, the group that the Pilgrims believe or belong to, are called Puritans, and they pretty much want everything to be serviceable. Your clothing couldn't be flashy and bright colors. You couldn't laugh too much or have too much fun. Everything had to be working because that's what they believed their God wanted. They educated their children, they educated the girls, but only so that girls could read, so they could read the Bible. They weren't educated to be able to read. They didn't believe you should read anything but the Bible ever. And there were no fun books. There was no going to the library and getting the cool books that you like to read. I'm blanking out the Wimpy Kid books, the I Survived books, none of that. Nothing that wasn't the Bible, and kept your mind focused on things that had to do with being spiritual. Anything that was frivolous was not allowed. In 1607, the group, the Separatist Church, had broken with the Church of England and had moved to the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands were very tolerant people, and they let them live there for about 10 years. But the Netherlands people, the Dutch people, did not have the same laws that the separatists did. Their children were out having a good time and going skating and playing and having fun. The British children, the Puritan children, were wanting to act more like them. So the parents were getting upset about this. They began to also have economic issues. Some of them had a hard time getting jobs. And they decided that they were going to go back to England and join in forming a colony with the Virginia's Hudson River Company. They called themselves Puritans, and they called anybody who was not a Puritan a stranger. Okay, so they set sail on the Mayflower. The voyage took 65 days. That's over 2 months that they're on this boat sailing over to the New World. There were lots of storms and very rough seas kept them from landing in Virginia. They planned to land sort of in the same area as the Jamestown colony, but that didn't happen. They ended up landing way farther north in what was eventually going to be known as Massachusetts, which is a lot farther north. The non-Puritans in the group, and remember, only 35 of these people were Puritans, argued that since they hadn't landed in Virginia, that the compact that they had, the rules that they had agreed on did not apply since they were not in Virginia. This created a big crisis. So on November the 11th of 1620, 41 men, including 2 indentured servants, signed what they called the Mayflower Compact, which they agreed would be the binding rule of this colony, since the rules that they had, the charter they had, was for Virginia, and that's not where they are. They decided we got to make new rules because those rules don't work where we are. They agreed that the colonists would remain loyal subjects to King James, even though they needed to be able to govern themselves. The colonists would create and enact, quote, laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, unquote, for the good of the colony, and they would all agree to abide by those laws. The colonists would create one society and work together to further it, to make it advance, and they would live in accordance with the Christian faith. Now, they all agreed and signed that. Women and children didn't get to sign, but all of the men signed. On November the 21st of 1620, they elected a man named John Carver as the first mayor and named their colony Plymouth Colony. While they were deciding where they were going to build their houses and stuff, they lived on the Mayflower on the ship, and they would sleep on the ship at night, and they would go and work on building homes and storage buildings during the day. It was a very severe winter. Now, they landed in November, so there was no chance of getting any food grown or anything much done before the winter, because it was pretty much already winter. So all they basically had was what they could find in the forest. And if it's winter, there's not going to be a lot of berries. There's not going to be a lot of animals, because a lot of the animals hibernate, or they move further south, or they just hide because they don't have food either. And there's not a whole lot to find to be able to eat. So they are in a bad position here. All they pretty much have is what they brought with them. And let's be honest, a lot of that's already gone. More than half of the colonists died that first winter. John Carver died in April, and the colony unanimously chose a man named William Bradford as their new mayor. Now, he must have done a pretty good job, because he was reelected 30 times as mayor. And in fact, from 1621 until 1656, he was mayor that entire time, except for 5 years in there where somebody else was mayor here and there, a little bit at a time. A man named Miles Standish was put in charge of the militia and protection of the colony. He was kind of the military commander. The life there was very hard. And remember, there are no fields already prepared. All this is wilderness and trees. And to make a field, you have to cut down all of the trees. And they don't have chainsaws. They're doing this with saws and maybe axes. You have to dig the stumps out. Pardon me. If there are rocks, you have to dig all of those out and move them. You have to make this land clear and burn everything on top of it before you can plow it and plant it, and now plant your seeds, and it takes several months for them to grow. This is a very labor-intensive, time-consuming process, and they have to do it, from scratch. So eventually they met a man named Squanto, or Tisquantum, who spoke English. He was one of the Patuxet Indians, or he was a member of the Patuxet tribe. He had learned English somewhere along the way. I actually have a video where I talk a little bit more about Squanto in depth. He's a very interesting person, but he served as a go-between between the colonists and Massasoit, who was the chief of the Patuxet people. He taught the Pilgrims to plant corn, to fish, and hunt for beaver. And so this was beginning to be a little more workable situation. They learned how to plant stuff that was going to actually grow for them, and how to begin surviving on the land. They became successful enough that in the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims agreed to share their first harvest feast with the Patuxet people. This meal is now considered the basis of the Thanksgiving holiday. It mostly consisted of deer, seafood, and vegetables. Potatoes had not yet been introduced to North America. Those actually came from South America. As far as their relations with the Pawtuxet people and the Native American people went, Squanto died in 1622. The Massasoit and the Narragansett tribes were not very friendly with the colonists. The Pilgrims kept expanding and taking more land and clearing more land. And when they cleared the land, a lot of the wildlife would leave the area. And that's what the Native Americans were counting on for their food. And so this was not a happy place for these people to be. William Bradford died in 1657, predicting that there would be a war at some point with the Native Americans. In 1675, King Philip's War began. King Philip was actually named Metacomet or Metacom, depending on who you read, and he was the son of Massasoit. He had become the chief of the Patuxent Indians in 1660. This war went on for several months and ended with 5,000 people dead. 3/4 of those were Native Americans. So it was much, much harder on the Native tribes than it was on the colonists, partly because the colonists have better weapons. The legacy of the Pilgrims is that more colonists kept coming from England and joining the colony because James I and Charles I, his son, were very unpopular. They were Scottish kings in Great Britain, in England, and not very popular people. So a lot of people were looking to leave England. Also, there's no unclaimed land in England, and they're starting to hear stories of, all of this land in this new world. We can go there, we can get land for ourselves. Maybe we can make a better living than we're making here in England. So in 1630, 1,000 Puritan refugees under the command of Governor John Winthrop came and established what was going to be called the Massachusetts Bay Colony, with Boston as its capital. Around 1630, the Plymouth colony actually broke up, and Miles Standish and William Bradford and some others had moved off to found their own settlements and kind of just got absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the colony of Plymouth didn't exist anymore. Now, the original settlers, the original Pilgrims, had always been called the old comers. You know how we have newcomers? Well, they were the old comers because they were the first ones. Until after his death, William Bradford had written a manuscript, a book in longhand. It hadn't been printed on a printed press yet, and this was discovered. And in this, he called the original settlers saints or pilgrims, and that got picked up, and that's why we call those people, those original people that came, the Pilgrims. That's all I have for you. I hope you've been more interested than Scout. You can see that she is just all wrapped up in this story. I hope it was more interesting for you. Please let me know what you think. Let me know what you would like for me to talk to you about. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you the next time on the Tortilla Cat Files.